Hello, what's up, guys? We're joined today by an amazing author, Hafsa Kanjwal. She wrote an excellent book called Colonizing Kashmir. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Hafsa Kanjwal, and I'm an associate professor of history, specifically South Asian history at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania.
What made you interested in writing this book?
So my PhD work was on Kashmir. So I guess it's linked to that. But I guess more personally, I was born in Kashmir, in Indian occupied Kashmir in Srinagar. My family moved to the U.S. when I was pretty young in the early 1990s, when there was an armed rebellion and mass popular uprising there against the Indian state. And I guess growing up in the US, I was obviously following through family stories and, hearing people talk about what's happening in Kashmir,
Mm.
what was going on. But as I got older and wanted to learn more and read books and kind of understand the history better, especially when I was in college and high school, I realized that there really wasn't much that reflected the kinds of stories that either I'd personally experienced or that my family had told me about. And the reason for that was that so much of everything that's really was written about Kashmir was really from, especially the prism of the Indian nation state or kind of the India-Pakistan dispute. And so I was committed to kind of pushing back against those perspectives and really centering Kashmir, its history, and really people's experience especially under India's colonial occupation in my own work.
Yeah, in your book, you go over a little bit about how, especially the West relation to Kashmir was really playing into, especially under Bakshi, was playing into sort of a Cold War alliance. Like the West sort of needed India on its side, so it was okay with sort of letting the Kashmir issue go. Did that relationship change in any way after the end of the Cold War? Did America, the West, sort of just generally keep on the Indian side of things?
I think it actually accelerated after the Cold War, and definitely in the 90s and in the early 2000s, especially with the war on terror. The U.S. even, I guess, thinking about the West, but specifically the U.S., which is the context I'm more familiar with. It's really interesting that even during the Cold War, though, initially they kind of are very close, of course, to Pakistan. But then because there is still these fears about China, even as early as the 1960s, with the Indochina War, they start to also get closer to India. Because this idea of seeing India as a counter to China has been in existence for a while. So what the US does is really kind of try to play both India and Pakistan because it has different political interests. For Pakistan, it's to uphold the military regimes there and to ensure that it doesn't fall to communism. But with India, they recognize that it's an important state, and of course could serve as a potential rival to China. And so that's really they've kind of played this double game with both countries. But after 9/11 is when you kind of really see the U.S. like utilizing a lot of the logics that India used to describe the Kashmir freedom movement through the rubric of terrorism.
Mm, mm. Um, what about modern day Russia? Because the USSR was obviously very close ally to India, and it sort of faltered on the Kashmir issue, but it usually took the Indian states' side. Has that relationship changed at all since the end of the Cold War?
I haven't really followed that as much, but I don't think it's changed significantly, to be honest. And India today also, part of the reason why the US is somewhat upset with India is because India still wants to maintain its ties to Russia while at the same time be close to the US as well. So I don't necessarily think Russia's kind of role has evolved, especially given that one of the main countries that provides arms to the Indian state is Russia.
Of course. So, pulling this all back, could you give us a little bit of context for anybody who's sort of new to this about what Kashmir was like before 1947, and then just the, like, I know it's a very hard question to ask, but just like a very brief overall general history of how it became incorporated into India.
Yeah, thanks for this question. It's always hard to know where to start. I do want to make a couple of points before I kind of start with the modern history. Part of what a lot of people don't understand about Kashmir is that this was a region that had been a kingdom for centuries in the ancient period and the medieval period. Really had kind of a distinct identity, and then of course in the pre-colonial period, as different imperial formations are shaped. Kashmir also then becomes a province, first within the Mughal Empire, then the Afghan Empire, and then the Sikh Empire. Um, and then finally, at the time of British colonial rule in the subcontinent, Kashmir is basically a princely state, one of the largest princely states. And so the British, as they're expanding in the subcontinent, they want to take over Punjab, and they do so with the help of a Hindu warlord from the region of Jammu called Gulab Singh. And they basically sell or give Kashmir to him. And he kind of expands the territory beyond the Kashmir Valley to Jammu, Ladakh, Gilgit Baltistan, Poonch, and all of those different regions basically make up what we call the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And so, for those who are somewhat familiar with the history of the subcontinent, princely states were states that had some level of autonomy. They weren't directly governed by the British. Those parts of the subcontinent were called British India. And so, Jammu and Kashmir was one of the largest princely states, one of the most wealthy as well, especially given that the Maharaja was extremely, extremely extractive towards his mostly Muslim majority population. Many of whom were peasants and artisans and laborers. And so, in the context of kind of a anti-colonial movement against the British in the subcontinent, within the Jammu and Kashmir princely state, there actually emerges an anti-monarchical or anti-Dogra uprising. And so this is where Kashmir's freedom movement actually is before 1947 itself. It really kicks up in the 1930s. And at the time of partition, when the British leave the subcontinent and India and Pakistan are both created, the future of the princely states was basically left to the rulers, and they had to keep in mind the demographics of the state as well as the geography of the state. So, in the case of Kashmir, Kashmir was geographically contiguous to both India and Pakistan, although most of its ties in this period were really to the territories that became Pakistan. There was no all year round link that connected the Kashmir Valley to the Indian mainland, for example. But there were roads that connected the Kashmir Valley to other parts of the parts of Punjab that became part of Pakistan. And so during this time, the Maharaja basically faces a massive uprising, especially in the region of Jammu, as well as like the border areas with the Pakistan state. Many of the people there were worried that he was going to accede to India, and so that rebellion is dealt with really strongly by the Maharaja. So, in what's called the Jammu massacre, almost 250,000 Muslims are killed, and another 250,000 and perhaps more are also displaced into what becomes Pakistan. And so the memory of this massacre is really erased. And instead, what's focused on is the fact that Pakhtun tribesmen from the region of the Northwest province, in what also became Pakistan, basically come towards the Jammu and Kashmir state. From their perspective, they are trying to liberate the Muslims there from the Dogra Maharaja. And so as they're going towards the state administration basically panics and seeks help from the Maharaja himself, seeks help from the government of India for military assistance. And so the Indian government basically says that they would provide the Maharaja with military assistance as long as he signed a treaty of accession. And then there's a lot of controversies. I won't go into that here about when and how that treaty was signed and whether or not it was actually signed before the Indian Army actually got in. But basically, the Indian Army arrives in Kashmir on October 27th, perhaps sometime before as well. And that is really when Kashmiris situate the start of India's occupation in Kashmir. And India and Pakistan then subsequently go to war over the region. and the region is divided. The United Nations gets involved as well. India asks it to intervene, and the UN basically calls for a cessation of hostilities, as well as a plebiscite or some kind of vote so that Kashmiris could vote who they wanted to join, either India or Pakistan. And this really has been the bulk of the issue, right? That in this moment, the region is disputed, divided, fought over, and the people of the region were not paid attention to in terms of what they wanted. And up until today, that plebiscite or that vote hasn't taken place. Kashmiris haven't been able to exercise their right to self determination, and this is really why that year in particular, 1947, is important.
Thank you so much for that. That's very enlightening. Um, how your book focuses a lot on this sort of period of normalization between Kashmir and Indian sort of rule, and some people have even argued that the reforms that were done under Bakshi were good in some sort of sense. But you argue that that was actually part of their colonial rule, right? Like that was a way of fomenting colonial rule. Can you explain why? Even though, like on the surface, a lot of these reforms seemed good, it was still part of colonialism.
Yeah, so one of the main things that I argue in the book is that India uses state building and also these client regimes that are placed in power in Kashmir to entrench its colonial occupation of Kashmir. And the reason I look at like state building policies or certain reforms or normalization is that they were really intended to kind of remake Kashmiri sentiments in favor of India. Given the fact that this was still a dispute, it was still being discussed at the international stage. The plebiscite resolutions were, still in, very much being talked about. India had to basically find a way um, to to change or socially kind of engineer some sort of consent for its rule within the territory that it governed or it ruled over. And so one of the things that these client regimes did, especially Bakshi's regime, is they because they were very active in the anti-Dogra monarchical uprising, and they really knew that Kashmiris, especially Kashmir's Muslim population, was extremely marginalized, especially like in terms of education, in terms of economic development, jobs, etc. So they thought that if they kind of gave certain benefits to this population, built schools, gave them jobs, employment, etc., that people would be in favor of India's rule. And so state building then, and I examined state building through a number of different avenues. I examined it through education, cultural reform, like the creation of a cultural intelligentsia in Kashmir, through economic development, building of infrastructure. So, it's like a very kind of thorough examination of state building. And I basically argue that state building was a way for India to entrench its rule in Kashmir and tried to change the subjectivities of the people. So just to give you an example of what that looked like, um, India actually gave the Kashmir state a lot of rice subsidies, and a lot of kind of grants that didn't even have to be paid back, right? So with other Indian states, many of the funding or the aid that was given as loans that would have to be paid back, but that wasn't the case with the Jammu and Kashmir state. And what's interesting is Bakshi was actually able to kind of leverage the fact that Kashmir was politically unstable and that people could potentially still have political aspirations that wouldn't align with India. He was kind of able to do that to negotiate like even more funds or even more resources for the Kashmir state. But the problem with that is that this wasn't a sort of like development that was really being done to actually make the lives of people better. But what it really did was make Kashmiris a lot more financially dependent on India, to the point that after India spent all of this money and resources, part of what it was able to argue is, look, you cannot survive on your own. You're completely kind of dependent on us, and also kind of describing Kashmiris as or Kashmir as a begging bowl or people who are ungrateful, kind of using a lot of those colonial tropes to talk about the people of Kashmir. And so for me, part of how this colonization of Kashmir took place was through state building itself, which further kind of attempted to integrate Kashmir legally, financially, culturally, etc., to the Indian nation state.
One of the things I found fascinating was how Bakshi's government would use sort of like these tourist flyers, and in those flyers they would like tell like a lot of myths about Kashmir, and it's this wonderful place, and we sort of love being under Indian rule, and also Hollywood, no, Bollywood films would go there, and they would portray it as this beautiful place that's always been part of India. How do you think Kashmir became, like, culturally in viewed? Like, was there also sort of a cultural, selling of Kashmir as always having been part of India?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was also really integral to this normalization campaign, is to make sure that Indians who may have not been able to travel to Kashmir could travel to Kashmir more easily. And the tunnel, like there was a tunnel that write about in the book as well. That tunnel, it's called the Banihal Tunnel, actually ended up making it so that there was finally an all year round link between the Kashmir Valley and the Indian mainland. um, and so that allowed for Indians to come to Kashmir all year round. And there really was a strong push, like both the Indian government, different tourism operators in India, but also in Kashmir, like the state's Department of Tourism, really pushed tourism as a way for Indians to come to Kashmir and see it as their kind of their land, right? Um, and so in these guidebooks, I kind of analyzed what were the parts of Kashmir's history that they focused on. And one of the things that I thought was really surprising was that for the international community, especially given that this was under Nehru and India was proclaiming itself to be a secular democracy, um, for the international community, the Indian state would present that, Kashmir is a Muslim majority region and they've chosen to join India. And so that kind of goes against the two nation theory and the creation or the need for the creation of Pakistan. But what's interesting is that in like when you actually look at both the films themselves, as well as this production about Kashmir. Um, in addition to it being positioned as a place of desire and the people racialized in particular ways, there was also this narrative that this was like really integrally linked to Hinduism. And so in that, and of course there are, of course, Hindu histories of the region, but it was done so to the exclusion of other religions, and in particular Islam, as as I argued in the book. And so that to me is really interesting because part of what I also tried to argue in the book is that there is this link between Indian secularism and Hindu majoritarianism, that sometimes gets erased when you only focus on these majoritarian ideals or this idea that India is authentically Hindu, as being something that only the Hindu nationalists or like groups like the BJP tout. But yeah, films as well. One of the interesting or things that I noted is that despite the fact that Kashmir had a Muslim majority population, there were very, very few, if any, Muslim characters in these films. And the ones that were like kind of presented as imperfect national subjects. They didn't really speak well. They were kind of dumb, right? So that also gives you a sense of how Kashmiri Muslims in particular were being racialized.
Mm. And then in some of them even, they would be like terrorists or villains or something of that sort, right? So
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah, so definitely, I mean, that definitely picks up in the late 1980s,
mm,
with a whole host of films, and that's directly in response to Kashmiri resistance, right? So once Kashmiris are not just this kind of people that you have to develop, like this backwards people that you have to develop, and they actually start resisting and they pick up the gun and they start protesting your rule, then that's when Bollywood films like Mission Kashmir or Roja, etc., really kind of focus on that terrorism trope.
I see. Um, picked up on it a little bit, but India, it's relations to Kashmir. It used to present itself as like a secular democracy, and as you mentioned, it was never truly like that. It was always sort of part of a Hindu majoritarian rule. But as the mask has sort of slipped off, and Indian democracy has more been redefined along Hinduvata lines as being for Hinduism. How has that shaped this relationship that it had with Kashmir?
I think with like the secular nationalists in India, like Nehru, part of how they perceived the way that they would try to manage or control Kashmir is through kind of trying to assimilate it or trying to show Kashmiris all the benefits that they could get under Indian rule, which is what I call the politics of life in the book. And so the idea was that as long as India could provide these benefits and show Kashmiris that being under Indian rule was good for them, then Kashmiri Muslims would eventually kind of become these integrated Indian subjects. And of course, that didn't happen. And so when Kashmiris led an armed rebellion, when they pushed back, when they protested, when they still demanded like freedom or azadi, the Indian state responded really, really brutally. And this was even before Hindutva. This is when the region became super militarized in the 1990s. There were a series of high profile massacres, killings, um, disappearances, uh, all of the different human rights violations that you may hear about. And so that was kind of a different way of then trying to make it so that resistance to Indian rule would become too costly. And so that was one attempt to kind of subdue people. Um, and yet, at the same time, one of the things that has existed across these years, these decades, since 2019, is that at least nominally, there was still this idea of some kind of autonomous status for Kashmir. And even though India eroded Kashmir's autonomy, one of the things that was still really important is that non Kashmiris could not buy land or property in the region. And so this is something that was there to kind of protect Kashmir's demography and make sure that, Indians didn't just kind of come in mass and settle the place and change the demography altogether. And this is something that really irritated Hindu nationalist groups, including the BJP, but also even as early as the 1950s, groups like the Jansangh. And so they've always advocated for Kashmir's autonomy to be removed. And finally, when Modi comes to power in 2019, that is what they do. And so I think with Hindutva, the idea is less that you can kind of assimilate Kashmiri Muslims or kind of change them in terms of their subjectivities because they don't really care about that. I think what their aim is to actually slowly start to like fundamentally transform the landscape, the culture, and really push their idea of what a Hindu state or a Hindu Rashtra is in the region by imposing like the Hindi language, for example, um, and and then eventually kind of either change people's subjectivities towards that, or if they continue to resist or they continue to push back, then replacing them altogether. So I think that is something that Hindutva has seen as, the Congress Party and the secular nationalists. They didn't deal with this issue of Kashmir well. You even heard it in their logic or their reasoning for why Article 370 was removed. It was that, oh well, with it terrorism existed, or with it this idea of separatism existed. And so for them to fundamentally change the demographics of the region, fully annex it, is the way to finally kind of resolve the Kashmir issue.
Have we seen large land grabs since the dissolution of Kashmir's special status?
I mean, one of the things that is kind of important to know is that the army already always had access to a significant portion of Kashmir's land through the building of like their own cantonments and training areas and so on and so forth. But now what we're seeing, and one of the things that I think is important to also highlight is that um, the one of the main ways in which India like also accelerated its repression in Kashmir is through really decimating civil society as well as journalism. So even through really difficult times when in the 90s and the 2000s, when there was a lot of repression, a lot of people were being arrested, there was at least like some local discussion happening about what's going on. At least the local media would cover like killings and deaths and so on. Um, and after 2019, the Indian government basically goes through and decimates civil society, the organizations that were doing this documentation, as well as local newspapers and journalism and so on and so forth. And so it's hard to figure out the actual numbers of what these land grabs look like. And there are groups that are kind of trying to um, figure out like because basically how it's announced is that there'll be like one announcement and like some Indian newspaper will carry something like, X amount of canals of land is being given to this corporation, or India's building a housing project in this area with this amount of land. And so people are kind of trying to figure out what that looks like. But it hasn't those figures haven't been released either from activist groups or the Indian government. And of course, the Indian government wouldn't want to release them because, they don't want to create some kind of like a moral panic or whatever that really basically justifies what activists have been saying all along that this is a settler colonial project. But one of the things that we do know, though, is that the demographic engineering has definitely started. So one of the things that the Indian government passed after 2019 was a law that basically took away this idea of Kashmiri permanent residency that only allowed Kashmiri permanent residents to gain employment in the state and vote in local elections, etc. And there's this thing called domicile, which has replaced that category. And to be domiciled, you just have to live in Kashmir for 7 years or study in Kashmir for a certain amount of time. And so this is basically the law that is now allowing Indians to claim domicile in Kashmir. And a recent report, just actually before the Pahalgam attack happened, had stated that there were over 80,000 domiciles that had been given to non-Kashmiris just since 2023 alone. And so we don't know the total number since 2019 or 2020, but these are certainly numbers that make Kashmiris really, really nervous. Because again, the settler colonial kind of structural changes don't happen overnight. It takes time. It's done in one way, it's done in another way. But the idea is kind of again to like fully re-engineer what this place looks like, and also the history and the memory of the place as well.
Absolutely. Um, th- this region, Kashmir, has been sort of a catalyst for a lot of conflicts between India and Pakistan. Why do you think it is always sort of been a starting ground, right? You know, even recently with the attacks by the TRF.
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of like reasons and explanations that scholars give for why Kashmir is, I guess, really desired by both countries. Um, Part of what Kashmiri scholars are trying to do is push back against this idea that the Kashmir issue is just this territorial dispute between India and Pakistan, which it often just kind of gets whittled down to. I spoke a little bit earlier about like an earlier history of resistance against monarchical rule and so on. But for sure, of course, partition and what happened at the time of partition is really significant for the story as well. As I mentioned, India really tried to position Kashmir as a Muslim majority region that was a part of this new Indian secular state in opposition to a theocratic Pakistan. And of course, for Pakistan, it was important given that it had its also kind of claim or reason for being was that it was a state that would house or protect the Muslims of the subcontinent. And so not having one of the main Muslim majority regions of the subcontinent there would kind of put a question mark on that as well. So there's these ideological things that exist for sure. But I think for me, the way that and of course, one of the other things that people also argue is that Kashmir is obviously very resource rich. Three of the rivers that go through Kashmir are really important for India and Pakistan as well. That's why the Indus Waters Treaty was signed. which is something that India threatened or actually did suspend, but I'm not sure. I don't think they've actually stopped the water. But resources is definitely really important, especially given that both Pakistan and India will face water shortages as climate change goes on. So, and then there's also some minerals, right? So it's kind of these material reasons, these ideological reasons. But for me, what I think is increasingly becoming evident is that there is this kind of, and it's linked to this idea of Hindu nationalism, but again, both its iterations or majoritarianism, both its iterations as it comes up in Hindutva, but also Indian secular nationalism, where the British really presented the entire subcontinent as belonging to Hindus, and they presented themselves um, as kind of protecting the Hindus from the previous rulers who were the despots, and that was the Mughals. And so a lot of these narratives about the region's history, uh, and Muslim histories in particular, have been internalized by much of India's like nationalist leadership, and that goes on until today. I mean, even today, no matter how many books you write about like what the Mughal period actually was like, or what these different earlier periods, ancient India or whatever was like, nobody really cares. They have their own narratives, and they're going to stick to it. So I think Kashmir is really important as part of this idea of an Akhand Bharat. And for India, it becomes especially like really, really emotional because they see it as so integral to their vision of what that kind of Hindu holy land looks like. And if you look at, and I sometimes show some of these images, like if you look at Hindu nationalist like geographical images, like where there's a body of a Hindu goddess over the map of the subcontinent, like kind of just showing like Mother India, so to speak, or Bharat Mata. Her head, the goddess's head, is actually where Kashmir is, and so that's how integral it is to this imaginary. So I think that's kind of one of the main ways that I'm starting to think about why it's become such a flashpoint.
Right, absolutely. Within their mythology, was Kashmir sort of Hindu land that was taken over by Muslims, or what is their narrative exactly?
Yeah, exactly. So the idea is that the original people of Kashmir were Hindu, and that it was Hindu land, and then the Muslim invaders came from Central Asia, and they forcibly converted people. There's also sometimes narratives of like kind of like six generations or six different points in which there was a Hindu exodus from Kashmir. That's how they explain the region, the fact that the region is Muslim majority. And so now basically the narrative is that all India is doing is just bringing it back to its rightful owners, who are the Hindus.
And of course, what's the actual history, right? Islam spread into the region very naturally, rather than how they're portraying it, of course.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that um, that is really, there's so many different ways you can kind of pick at this narrative. I will maybe think through three things. One is this idea of like Hindu, who is a Hindu, right? And there were so many different traditions, like devotional traditions that were practiced in the subcontinent before the arrival or before Islam, and of course before the British. And so there are scholars who talk about how like the category of like Hinduism or Hindu itself is was really constructed or consolidated in a much later period, and especially um, with British Orientalists and against Islam. So that's one kind of narrative, is that can we really call the different devotional groups that existed in ancient or medieval subcontinent, were they all quote unquote Hindus? Um, and Kashmir actually had a very rich kind of indigenous, I guess you could call it like a spiritual or religious tradition, which was called Kashmiri Shaivism. And so that practice is then linked on to Hinduism, and so that is how it's like, oh, this was originally or indigenously a Hindu region. So that's one thing. The second thing is this idea of like insiders and outsiders, because part of what the issue is that we are so the way that we see the past is also informed by our understanding of contemporary borders, right? So why is it that someone like Babur, for example, who is coming into North India from like Uzbekistan or Kabul, which I mean, it really isn't that far geographically. Why is he a foreigner to the region, but someone who comes from South India, which is quite far from North India, is not a foreigner, right? So we're kind of imposing our own understandings of about borders and boundaries and who's foreign, who's not foreign from today into the past, when that may not have been how they understood like regions, or obviously there wasn't a national identity for the region, as there is today. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that Islam comes into the region, and over a period of time, it's not like people like automatically convert like with the rest of the subcontinent. It takes centuries before certain regions like northwest of the subcontinent, Kashmir, as well as Bengal, become Muslim majority. And it's mostly done through either local or like Central Asian, like Persian missionaries. And so there's a debate within the scholarship as to who had more of an important role, whether it was the local missionaries or the Central Asian missionaries. But the debate isn't about like whether it was forcibly, forced on the people and so on. And the narrative is basically that a lot of people did convert, and a lot of lower caste communities in Kashmir converted to Islam or reverted to Islam, whatever language you want to use for that, because they were trying to escape the oppressive caste system that existed. And so people are really kind of trying to go back into the medieval and ancient history because so much of it has been defined by both how British colonialism and Orientalism has understood Indian history, but also how like Hindutva or Hindu nationalism or even secular nationalism has then reinterpreted this history as well. So I'm hopeful that we'll kind of have a lot better of an understanding of medieval and ancient pasts, not just in Kashmir, but across. And there's a lot of literature that exists for the subcontinent right now, but there's less so on Kashmir, and I'm hoping that that changes.
Absolutely. Do you see that change happening in the mainstream at all, or is it for now just sort of relegated to, very academic circles?
It's not really happening in the mainstream, to be honest. And I think there's ways where even like sometimes Kashmiri Muslims will like internalize a lot of those arguments. So for example, I've talked to people who've said things like, "Oh, but it's true though. Like it's just the Hindus who are indigenous to the region, right?" So the way in which like the educational systems, the narratives, like um, they're so pervasive that even the people who are, like, directly being harmed by these narratives, have unfortunately internalized it. So yeah, I think that's something that definitely needs to be, made a lot more, mainstream.
Why do you think denying Kashmiri indigeneity is so important to this narrative? We see this played out a lot all over the world, like Palestine, other places. But why is it so important that Kashmiris can't be indigenous to this region?
So, specifically, it's Kashmiri Muslims that can't be indigenous. The people that they say are indigenous are Kashmiri Pundits or Kashmiri Brahmins, Kashmiri Hindus, basically, who were about 5% of the population at the time of the valley at the time of 1947. And so the narrative then is that Kashmiri Hindus are indigenous, Kashmiri Muslims are not. And so that's why Kashmir belongs with India. So the denial of Muslim indigeneity is basically an attempt to then like say that this region belongs to India. But um, um, part of what I think is happening and I'm actually looking at indigeneity for my next project and how constructions of indigeneity in the subcontinent actually in many ways do more harm than good, because they are often weaponized for these like more right-wing politics. And we know this today where like the Hindu right has used a lot of this language of decolonization, right? To like portray their Hindu nationalist vision as being decolonization. And so, from this perspective, the colonial powers were not the British, they were the Muslims. And so, this is kind of the really dangerous terrain that exists right now in terms of political and public discourse. But ultimately, I think it's just all linked to this larger project of Hindu nationalism that seeks to deny Muslim indigeneity in the region.
Absolutely. There's many counter arguments that people make against Kashmiri self-determination. I was just wondering if you could break down a few of them, such as, the economy wouldn't be able to function, um, that Kashmir joined India willingly, that they're a source of terrorism. Could you just break down these sort of three big points that I see a lot?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting. A lot of the kind of counter arguments that are used really are so similar or parallel to the kinds of arguments that were used by other European colonial powers to not give independence or not decolonize, the different parts of the globe that they colonized. And so this idea that like the economy wouldn't be able to function um, or that Kashmiris wouldn't really be able to rule themselves, like wouldn't be able to have self-rule, right? That's exactly what the British said because they presented themselves as helping India's economy or the subcontinent's economy, and civilizing these people. So India really relies on these civilizational discourses in talking about how it's developing Kashmir, it's progressing Kashmir, even as the legacy of India's rule in Kashmir has been body bags, like almost 100,000 of them. And so, like, the sheer disconnect between what they say that they're doing, but what they've actually done, um, it's pretty striking. But just this idea that Kashmir's economy won't be able to function when, as I've kind of explained earlier, that this creation of economic dependency was a part of the colonial project. And so, of course, then it's then used against the people that it won't be able to function. But Kashmir was actually historically a major hub of trade and commerce, even before the British arrived. In different periods, it was part of the Silk Route, and so because of its location, kind of at the in many ways like to the south is what we call South Asia. Then there's the West Asia, Central Asia, but then also East Asia. Kashmir had trade ties with places like Tibet. And a lot of those histories have really been like not focused on or not talked about. But I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't be able to function economically unless people were ensuring that it wouldn't function, right? So that's one thing. This idea that Kashmir willingly joined India is also problematic because it was the Maharaja who acceded to India, given that he was facing this massive rebellion and had conducted this massacre. And there were certain groups within Kashmir, like Sheikh Abdullah, who became Kashmir's first prime minister. Abdullah was one of the main leaders of the anti Dogra agitation, who gave his consent to the accession, but only with the promise that Nehru had given him that Kashmir would have significant autonomy. And so over time, when Abdullah realized that India wasn't actually going to protect or actually give Kashmir that autonomy, he also kind of turned away. And then there's a whole another story about how he was brought back, etc. But and then this idea also, of course, about the plebiscite, right? That so much of the Kashmiri kind of political identity after 1947, different political movements, has been to exercise their right to self-determination through some sort of vote or referendum. And so in that story, there's really no willingness. Like if Kashmir had willingly, if there was a Kashmiri will involved, then India would not hesitate to hold a plebiscite. They would have held it, and they would have felt confident that they could win it. But it's pretty clear that they never felt confident that they could win it. Of course, with all anti colonial movements, especially when they resort to armed resistance, colonial powers label it as terrorism. So I don't think there's anything kind of surprising about the use of that here. And in addition to labeling it terrorism, one of the other things the Indian government has also done is to portray Kashmiri armed resistance in particular, but also really like non-armed resistance, like protests, writing things, anything that challenges India's sovereignty over Kashmir is depicted as being Pakistan sponsored. And that's a really particularly um, like nefarious narrative because it basically denies Kashmiris their agency. And it just makes it again about the India-Pakistan dispute and that we're not actually and so if we reframe how we think about Kashmir as it's not just an India-Pakistan dispute, but it is an anti-colonial struggle against occupation and so on, then of course Kashmiri voices are really important in that. But if you can completely shut down Kashmiri voices and say that any Kashmiri voice that does speak is only doing so at the behest of Pakistan, then you're basically saying like there's no justification in this or this is not a legitimate struggle. And so that's something that even we as academics face. There will be a lot of like disinformation campaigns um, against us saying that we are working at the behest of Pakistan, which is really just ludicrous. So these are definitely some of the ways in which India tries to suppress a Kashmiri agency. Um, yeah, I think those were most of my.
One other sort of thing I see often said is, what about the Pandits, right? If you bring up oppression of Kashmiri Muslims, people will talk about, oh, well, what about what happened to the Pandits? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned earlier, Kashmiri Pundits are the Hindus of the Kashmir Valley. They're mostly upper caste Brahmins. And at the time of partition, 1947, they were about 5% of the population of the valley. And yet, despite being a numerical minority, they were not politically insignificant. They were actually very politically significant, not just with the Dogras, but even earlier rulers, the Sikhs, the Afghans, the Mughals. The Mughals actually created this terminology, pundits, because they hired or they kind of provided patronage or had many of them in their court in Kashmir, because this was, again, as upper caste Brahmins, they were the literate class so they were the scribes and so on and so forth. And so they have enjoyed throughout history a close relationship with the different political powers or regimes that governed Kashmir. And in the Dogra period, many of the revenue officials who were extremely extractive towards Kashmiri Muslim peasants and artisans were Kashmiri Pandits. And so there was always kind of this like, even though Kashmir was depicted as this place which was um, this idea of Kashmiriyat, where Kashmiri Muslims and Pandits and everyone kind of all got along. This was a narrative that some of these client regimes, as well as the Indian government, kind of pushed again to show Kashmir as this secular place that fit within India. The class-based, caste-based hierarchies within Kashmiri society were really, really strong. And so in after 1947, as the government was really trying to empower Kashmiri Muslims so that they would also be more amenable to accession with India. And of course, many Kashmiri Pandits would have preferred some sort of relationship with India. Um, but there were some actually really interesting voices, like Raghunath Vaishnavi, who was called a Pakistani Pandit or Pakistani Bata, as it's called in Kashmiri, because he believed in Kashmiri self determination and he didn't necessarily think that Kashmir's future would lie with India. And so it is also important to note that there were these kind of contesting or different Kashmiri Pandit voices. It's not like the community all spoke with one voice throughout history. So, after 1947, a lot of the Kashmiri Pandits felt that in many ways, the government was being too appeasing to Kashmiri Muslims. And they also felt that the previous stronghold that they had in economic institutions, educational institutions, the bureaucracy was being challenged by the fact that more Kashmiri Muslims, especially given that they were a majority of the population, were now being represented in these institutions. And so even before the 1980s, which is when the armed rebellion begins, you start to see these tensions that erupt between where Kashmiri Pundits are feeling like their rights or their previous privileges are not being protected or paid attention to by the state government. And so at the time of this armed rebellion in the late 1980s, there is a a strong, obviously, anti-India agitation that's going on. There's also immense militarization that's happening as well, with over 700,000 Indian soldiers that are being brought in. So it's a period of chaos. And in that chaos, basically, around 120,000 or so Kashmiri Pundits, vast majority of them. There are some thousand that remain, but over 100,000 basically leave the Kashmir Valley, and they go to camps in Jammu, as well as in different parts of India, and then later some of them go abroad as well. And so the narrative of how they left, the conditions in which they left, are deeply polarizing and deeply contested. The Kashmiri Pundits who left, and also right wing and other groups in India, basically claim that they were forced to leave, and not just by the militants, but actually, like, the argument is that it was the Kashmiri Muslim population in general that basically pushed them out, or told them that they weren't welcome anymore. And there were a series of targeted killings of some Kashmiri Pandits, which is positioned as being like anti Hindu in nature, but it's actually not. Those targeted killings were directed towards both Hindus as well as Muslims who were seen as being functionaries of the state government, or of the state, of the Indian state, and close to the Indian state, right? So they were seen or perceived as being collaborators. So it wasn't like religiously motivated, but it was politically motivated killings. But nonetheless, in that atmosphere of targeted killings, of a kind of heightened um, sense of Kashmiri Muslimness, and also expressions of freedom as well. Many Kashmiri Pandits certainly felt very vulnerable about what their place in Kashmir would look like. And so I think fear in many ways did contribute to why many of them left. But a lot of Kashmiri Muslims also argue that there was a really deliberate attempt by the state at that time to create these cleavages in Kashmiri society. And that's actually not something that should be surprising to any of us, given that we know that colonial states operate by dividing and ruling, right? And they'll like that is one of the main functions in how colonial rule operates. And so many feel that the Indian government actually like increased this element of fear and kind of made the Kashmiri Pandit community panic even further, and then subsequently facilitated their departure from Kashmir. And then decided that it would deal with the Kashmiri Muslim population at large, which was largely protesting, etc., through a series of massacres. And so, again, depending on who you talk to, you'll get a different narrative of what happened. There were many Kashmiri Pandits who remained in Kashmir and said that their narrative is actually very different from those who left, in that they said that they were actually protected and told by their Muslim neighbors to stay, that this was still their home. Many of the Kashmiri pro-freedom groups have always told the pundits that Kashmir is theirs, like, they should come back and live in neighborhoods with Muslim neighbors, and not in these settlements that the Indian government is trying to construct for Hindus only. And there's also been calls for having some sort of investigation into what actually happened, which has been denied by the Indian government. But instead, what you've seen is like the pain of this migration, or what's called an exodus, is being weaponized, and it's being used against the movement for self determination, to try to depict it as being like especially anti minority, and religiously fundamentalist, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. I know this is a difficult question to answer, but could you give us a very, very brief history of armed resistance within Kashmir and the various groups? I know that there's a lot of groups, but the various groups and how we ended up at our current climate with the TRF, the Resistance Front.
Yeah, so armed resistance has is often seen as starting in the late 1980s. But there were actually attempts to have an armed resistance movement in Kashmir in the 60s and 70s as well, with a group called Al Fatah, for example. That actually, Fatah, if you can tell by the name, modeled itself after the Palestinian group, right? And so there, but those were like quashed very soon after they got started. But what's interesting for me is that it was actually um, Kashmiris who were from the Pakistan administered side, but also figures like Maqbul Butt, who's kind of seen as the ideologue or the founder of the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front. He was from the Indian occupied side. He went to Azad Kashmir, and the main idea that he had was that he would start this kind of armed cell from Azad Kashmir. And he and other figures like Amanullah Butt started an organization called the NLF, the National Liberation Front, which actually tried to get Pakistan support for an armed movement in Kashmir in the 70s. And yet at that time, the Pakistan state was not in favor of it. And so they actually arrested Maqbul Butt and many of the comrades of the NLF. Um, and so really then when we see armed resistance really kicking off then is in 1988, 1989, where groups like the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front now um, see that all the different peaceful ways in which they've tried to push back or get self-determination hasn't worked. More recently, in 1987, there was a rigged election that happened where a group called the Muslim United Front was a conglomeration of different political parties that sought a plebiscite or self-determination for Kashmir. And that election was massively rigged, and people say that many of them would have actually gotten elected, and the idea was that if they got elected, they would go on the Kashmir State Assembly and declare like Kashmir's independence. But of course, India could not let that happen, so that election was rigged. Sheikh Abdullah's son, Farooq Abdullah, was put in power, and that really kind of creates this immediate impetus for an armed movement, given that even like this electoral means is not working to get the right to self determination. So the groups that were formed most likely had some communication with Pakistan, but they were like local fighters of the JKLF. But then, as they started a series of attacks, the Indian government responded very violently and also brought in so many soldiers, and so they knew that they were really no match for all of this. And so many young men, mostly young men, went across the line of control, got trained in either Azad Kashmir or other camps in Pakistan, and then came back, and then that's really when the armed rebellion was like spread even further. I don't have the actual numbers of how many fighters there probably were, but there were a number of groups. JKLF was one, the Hizbul Mujahideen was another. And so different groups also may have had different understandings of what Kashmir's future would look like. So the JKLF saw Kashmir as like an independent state or entity. Hizbul Mujahideen wanted Kashmir to actually merge with Pakistan, and in some ways, the Indian government was also able to use some of these ideological divisions to create rifts within the armed movement as well. But another way that they created a major rift was that many surrendered militants or abducted militants were created into another militant faction or group called the Ikhwan, which basically was a group that was working at the behest of the Indian government, and would was there to kind of muddy the whole armed movement, and that they would commit a series of attacks and human rights violations and so on and so forth. And so India is really able to kind of quash this version of the armed resistance by the early 2000s. Already in 1993 or 1990, actually, sorry, 1994, JKLF gives up arms. His declares a ceasefire in the early 2000s. And then, of course, with 9/11 and Pakistan not being able to support Kashmiri resistance, given that it joins the US-led war on terror, um, there there isn't a lot happening in those years. But then we again start to see armed resistance emerging after 2010, when there's a series of summers of unrest in Kashmir. And what's interesting about this version of the armed resistance, it's obviously not as massive as it was in the 90s. And even like Indian intelligence officials will say that it was kind of homegrown in that most of the young men, especially given that the line of control became even more militarized and it was harder to move back in and out. Most of them were trained in Kashmir themselves, and they had to basically steal weapons from Indian forces to join. So they had very very little training, and they were really symbolic in that it was just kind of that classic guerrilla warfare where you know that you're really no match for this massive army, but that you are still trying to make sure that this narrative of normalization isn't accepted, or that Kashmiris are still resisting. And there was a lot of support for these rebels in like 2010 to 2019. 2016, especially, one of the main rebel commanders, Burhan Wani, was killed. He was a commander in Hizbul Mujahideen, and his funeral, if you look at pictures from that time, it's absolutely crazy. Like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Kashmiris defied curfew orders to pray consecutive funeral services at the time of his killing. And that summer also led to about 6 months of unrest where there was almost like regular protests, the Indian government attacking protesters, and kind of that cyclical repetitive violence, communication networks being clamped down on, so on and so forth. And after 2019, we kind of, there was a total communication clampdown with the revocation of the Article 370. Um, and then soon, we kind of began to observe that there were different factions that had changed their names. And so the Resistance Front was one of them. Um, and so it's unclear. I mean, again, like it's really, really difficult for even someone like me who studies Kashmir to get information because it's hard to talk to people there. And many of the local reporters who were covering armed resistance groups in Kashmir are just not able to anymore, given the clampdown on the media. And so I don't fully know what's going on with armed resistance. And again, of course, even with the Pahalgam attacks, there are questions around whether it was the TRF, or if they accepted it, but then there was another statement that came out that said they didn't accept it and that there was a cyber intrusion. People were also accusing the Indian government of conducting a false flag attack. I'm not sure. I can leave that question open in terms of like what actually happened. But yeah, I mean, it's just hard now to have a lot of information about armed resistance.
Absolutely. Talking to people from the region, some people, a select few people I've talked to have identified with Pakistan, Kashmiris. Well, what would an independent Kashmir look like to you? Would it simply just be self-determination through finally getting the plebiscite vote? Would it be like becoming a completely autonomous region? What exactly would it look like?
So, I don't have strong opinions on this question, especially, of course, independence or Pakistan being kind of two of the options that float around. One of the things that I think about, though, given that as a historian, as someone who's actually also very very critical of the nation state form and has seen it as really enacting a lot more violence than good. I whatever happens or however Kashmiris decide, I would hope that uh w- whatever that future arrangement is doesn't like mimic or create the same kind of issues or problems that exist with the nation state form altogether. And so for me, that is really important. Um, and so even like with the implementation of a plebiscite, the plebiscite itself only gave Kashmiris two options in Pakistan or India, because many of the Western powers at the time did not want independence as an option, because they didn't want like to leave the subcontinent, and then have it like be a bunch of different states. And so they don't want to necessarily create that precedence in Kashmir. But I think, independence is certainly something that many Kashmiris do want. Many Kashmiris also really see that independence is not an option, given that they live in a very hostile neighborhood with India, China, Pakistan, etc. And so they would just prefer to be with Pakistan, given the historical connections with Pakistan and with the people of Pakistan. So that question for me is really open. I don't like to impose like my own understandings of what that should be. I think that Kashmiris need to be given a chance to have open conversations about their future, which they really have not been given. Um, they haven't been able to even have, right, like conversations about like, okay, so if we were independent, what would that look like? If we were part of Pakistan, what would that look like? And so for me, demilitarization, allowing Kashmiris the space to politically plan, discuss amongst themselves, and think through these questions without fear of any kind of reprisal from any side is really important. And then, whatever people decide is what they decide. But I also think that the liberation of Kashmir is not just about Kashmir alone. It's also really linked to how we rethink or need to rethink the subcontinent in general. It's just like, especially like in recent years, it's just become like so clear to me that a lot of the post colonial nationalisms that emerged were extremely violent for different groups of people who were at the margins of these different national frameworks or narratives. And so, um, right now I'm even thinking about like what's happening in Bastar and Chhattisgarh, which is really not being talked about. And of course, it's the situation or the history of like that region in Kashmir is not the same. But I think part of how we can think about these questions is like, how do we respect different communities' desires and rights to be able to live freely in their land, not have their, to be able to have some sort of self rule, to be able to protect their resources, to be able to decide over what will happen to their resources, protect their land, ecology, etc. I think these are questions that are not just relevant to Kashmir, but are also relevant to, many other communities in the subcontinent. And how do we also make sure that we're not imposing like very homogenous ideas of like what national identity should look like? Um, so Kashmir kind of allows us, I think, to ask some of these questions.
Absolutely. With the tourist attacks, I think immediately connections were drawn to Palestine and Israel, even amongst Hindu nationalists who were saying, turn Kashmir into Gaza. Do you find these comparisons to other people's struggles, such as the Palestinian struggle, apt or concise or accurate, or do you feel as though it kind of, especially within online narratives and online educators who try to portray these issues to Western audiences, do you feel like it glosses over a lot of nuance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I might be one of those people who have also tried to draw some of those connections in my own work, just because, like, historically, the connections are really, really there. Both are, results of British colonialism, um, attempts at decolonization. In the case of Palestine, it's different in that it's like the imposition of an actual settler colonial project, which is what happens with the partition plan in Palestine. With the subcontinent, it's a little bit different. Like I wouldn't compare the two partitions, which sometimes people do with India, Pakistan, and with Palestine. They're not the same. But I think in terms of like, especially what I was talking about, like the view towards Kashmir by Indian nationalists, Hindu nationalists, these narratives of like indigeneity as being very exclusive, only one group can claim indigeneity, an erasure of like thousands and years of like a much richer, vibrant history. That to me is really compelling in terms of thinking through some of these connections. And then, of course, the moments of foundational violence with the Nakba in Palestine, the Jammu massacre in Kashmir, and then the various forms of like colonial occupation, settler colonial rule, in the aftermath of 1947 and 1948. So the connections are definitely there. Kashmiris themselves have been making the connections, which I think is important to know as well. there was always a fear amongst pro-freedom leaders in Kashmir, but also even some of these client politicians, actually, which is why they wanted this autonomy, that India would turn Kashmir into Palestine. And what they meant by that was that they would try to demographically change the population, and grab land and so on and so forth. So that fear always existed, and people were well aware that India was also increasingly looking to Israel as a model for its own policies in the region. And so I think the material links, the ideological links are all there. But of course, I don't think we can like completely conflate the two and just say they're exactly the same. How different modalities of control may operate in Kashmir may not exactly be the same in Palestine. One of the biggest differences I can think about is the fact that so much of the Palestinian population is actually in diaspora. They were exiled from their homes, right? And so that creates a very difficult or different sense of political community, political history, even the potential for resistance, than in Kashmir, where of course there are a lot of people who have been displaced, but the displacement has occurred in different ways. So so yeah, I mean, I do think it is important for us to see comparisons and not equate completely, but just to see resonances. And it's not just Palestine, obviously. I mean, when I was doing my research, I saw so many resonances with places like Puerto Rico, with with Hawaii as well, Western Sahara. And so colonialism is obviously a category, it's a way of rule, and it's going to look similar in different parts of the world. And so it's not surprising that there would be these intellectual or material connections. But of course, what I try to always say is that we should also attend to the specificities of a lot of these struggles as well.
Okay, thank you so much for that answer. I'll throw it to the room. Punjabi Kami, I know you had a couple questions.
Hi, yeah. Hi, Hafsa. It's nice to officially talk to you. And first and foremost, I wanted to say your work is extremely urgent, and I found it to effectively dive into the gap that's often neglected when it comes to discussion surrounding the region of Kashmir. I've recommended your book across my platforms a few times, and many people have expressed how eye-opening it's been for them in the midst of colonial propaganda and conditioning. People have shared that it's really altered their understanding of the past and radically shifted their perspective of the current reality. And personally, I can also attest to this because your research and the context that you study, the historical context, really put the puzzle pieces together for me. So I just first off wanted to say thank you for doing this labor. Um, but what I wanted to talk about was that with the rampant misinformation and like the false equivalences that are made, it's clear that a lot of work needs to be done. And in recent years, we've seen a handful of teach-ins across Turtle Island, but they seem to be far and in between. What do you think should be our next steps in the belly of the beast when it comes to Kashmir and building a more widespread solidarity movement for a liberated Kashmir?
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments and for reading the book and also for sharing it with others. I really appreciate it. This is an important question. It's something that I do think about, but I sometimes struggle with as well. Part of it has to do with what I mentioned earlier, where um, like just numerically, especially in Turtle Island, the number of people in the Kashmir diaspora is really not that many. I mean, there are of course people, and people have tried to be active, but in ways in which you can kind of like often see like other voices from impacted or marginalized communities take the lead and do events and organize. The Kashmiri diaspora has struggled to do that, and it's for a number of reasons. One that is definitely up there is that, um, given India's, transnational state repression, many of them fear for their families back home. They also fear for being able to travel in and out of Kashmir, etc. And so unfortunately, we just don't have that the just like in terms of bodies alone, like the number of people who can kind of speak on this issue in a clear way that allows other people to understand it and to see some of these connections. I hope that will change. But I also think in this case it's really important for the work of allyship to raise awareness, especially in the context where many people may fear for their families and so on. And so I do think that having like uh, additional teach-ins, bringing in like this work, sharing this work, sharing Kashmiri scholars and their writings or different figures, different historical figures. There's so much that actually I think is still hasn't been studied, hasn't been talked about. And so the scope for like learning and political education, I think, is really important. And there's a lot more that can be done there for people to really familiarize themselves with the nuances of the struggle. But then, of course, with political education, then you also have to like do other things, and take actions. And I think in this case, um, right now, the way that I see this is that, like I mentioned in my earlier comment, where Kashmir is not really isolated from what's happening across the region. Um, and increasingly, especially with what happened in the past 2 weeks or past 3 weeks, we really are starting to see the impact of India as a regional bully and a regional imperial power, in significant ways. And so the way that India's actions, policies, etc., impacts people in Bangladesh, people in Sri Lanka, of course, people in Pakistan, people in Nepal, the Maldives, and also Punjab, the Northeast, Chhattisgarh, Bastar, so all of these, um, all of these are really important to sites to understand how Indian state power expresses itself. So for me, like a coalition of different groups who are kind of working against um, the Indian state in different ways, and Hindutva, Brahmanical imperialism, caste supremacy, etc., is really important. Like, I think that can contribute towards the liberation of Kashmir as well, even if, of course, it is directly related, but even if it's kind of done in this comprehensive or kind of more expansive way. And the reason I say that is that it's hard to think about like what kinds of specific actions um, people who are here can take on Kashmir when we're just not able to connect with Kashmiri voices on the ground. So many struggles are informed by kind of this like dialectic between, okay, here's how the people on the ground are organizing. And that used to happen for us with Kashmir as well. Like we would be in touch with people who would say like, here's certain campaigns that you all can do. Here's, things that can happen from abroad, etc. But we just don't have access to those voices anymore because of the level of state repression. And so for me, I think about like my own positionality and like I'm confused about what is possible without that kind of feedback from groups on the ground who are resisting every day. And I'm sure they are, but again, we just have this total information gap with that. I don't know if that answers your question, but I hope that at least people can start continuing to have conversations about how to really organize in this moment, which is very bizarre and difficult for all of these reasons.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've heard people trying to find like mutual aid to donate to or direct ways to help those on the ground, but like given the challenges, it gets so difficult. But as you said, these conversations are really important. Like I know in organizing spaces, like a lot of my Kashmiri comrades talk about the neglect and invalidation, even in those niche spaces, like the lack of understanding. So my final question for you is, what are some learning materials or resources that you would recommend for people who are wanting to study the region further?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, there has been great work done, especially in like the last to 10 to 15 years, on Kashmir, its histories, like across different periods as well. Um, a lot of those resources were collected by an academic collective and also on the Stand with Kashmir website. It's called this Kashmir syllabus. Sorry. So I think that's a really important resource. And of course, there's been things that have been published since then as well, like more newer works that people can look at. I think for like there's a lot of really important documentaries as well. Um, and there's different collections of them online, but I'll name a few here. One is called Jashn Azadi. It's by Sanjay Kak. It's basically about how Kashmiris would celebrate India's Republic Day. And another is called Kashmir's Torture Trail. It's on BBC documentary, and it talks about um, the prevalence of torture used as a weapon of war by the Indian government. There's a number of documentaries also on widows, like half widows, as well as like family members of those who were disappeared. And so those resources definitely exist. I think they can be really important and powerful teaching tools for people who just want to visualize what this all looks like. And I think they have played an important role. Like cultural production has played a really important role in so many struggles around the world. There's a really important film, actually. I hope it's able to kind of be screened or be shown elsewhere. It's by a filmmaker named Arfat Sheikh. It's called Saffron Kingdom. And the story of how he actually did this film is something that I think is really powerful and inspiring, given that he wasn't even able to go back to Kashmir given the level of repression, and so he basically, like, used imagery and different I don't know the details because it's, like, computers and video stuff that I'm not as familiar with, but he was basically able to recreate Kashmir, and like, through using these different forms and then have particular scenes, as if they were filmed in Kashmir, and to tell a story basically of a massacre and the memories of that massacre, and also Indian state transnational repression to families who actually live in outside of Kashmir. And so I think this is something hopefully that we'll see more and more of different kinds of cultural production, different kinds of scholarly works. And yeah, and I hope that people view them together, read them together, and really start to better inform themselves on this issue.
To some extent, I feel like Kashmir remains very invisible within America. I mean, obviously, a lot of people have opened their eyes to the Palestinian uh, cause. Do you think that we could? What are some steps, small steps we could take to change that visibility? Would it just be talking? Obviously, you mentioned a lot of educational things. Would it just be simply talking and bringing it up in spaces, or is it a hard question to answer in general?
Um, I actually think I mean, I'm surprised there is, like, there's a growing movement of, like, South Asian, especially, like, younger folks who are, against imperialism, who are very critical of, what's happening in the region and Kash like, for the first time, I'm actually seeing, like, younger Indians express solidarity with Kashmir, and for the Kashmir freedom struggle and a real desire to learn about it. Like, this isn't really something that I would've even thought about, to be honest, like, 10 or 15 years ago, where there was just so much of that nationalism that was ingrained, and it was really difficult to get the story across. And in some ways, Palestine and people's kind of reframing or understanding of the toxicity of these narratives and the way in which history gets weaponized and all of this has kind of, I think, opened up people's eyes to be a lot more cognizant to what's going on in Kashmir. And so I think there is an opportunity to not just do political education, but also think through, like, I mean, the student movement. And bits of this are already kind of happening. So I don't want to say it's not happening, but to see, like, the ties that India also has to institutions and the way that Indian knowledge production, especially on universities and campuses, through different, like, South Asia centers, through relationships with like the local embassies and consulates, like how all of that is framed, and to really push back against a lot of that. I mean, I think like what's always interesting to me is how fragile India is as a state, and then also like if there's like any celebrity or anyone who says anything that challenges the narrative that India has about itself or that, people Indians on social media have about themselves, they'll just like really, really panic. And so, point like puncturing or kind of poking at this narrative that they've constructed about themselves is is really important. And I think that's the work that can happen. And that could happen in so many different ways. And it can also happen in solidarity with other groups who are also facing the wrath of the Indian state in different ways.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Henry, do you have any comments or questions?
I did. Thank you so much for all of for the book and for answering all the questions. It was a fascinating conversation. I did have one question, and I initially felt like it'd be taking what was a pretty action oriented, more practical conversation and turning it back into a more theoretical one. But I guess, like you point out in the book, a lot of the deafening silence amongst the subaltern studies group and the post colonial theorists. Um, and this idea of imperialism being a product of categories and categorization has contributed to perhaps like an academic ignorance um, the colonization of Kashmir. And even in the introduction, where you quote Nehru and his quote about Kashmiris, quote, not being virile people, it really sounds almost exactly like, or really reminded me at least a lot of Robert Orme and the classical British Orientalists, and the effeminacy of the inhabitants of Hindustan, and these parallels between, like you pointed out, the European colonization of South Asia and the attitude of the Indian state towards Kashmir are quite similar, and yet you have, like in Morocco, a similar narrative where this isn't really the same thing because this is kind of a personal thing. This is an internal conflict. It's something that is not like colonization because that really has to do with applying somehow a foreign lens or some kind of imperialist categories. Do you think do you think that the subaltern school, that the post-colonial theorists have taken away this materialist, historically grounded story of the experiences of Kashmiri people and allowed for a seemingly left wing, seemingly radical view that manages to ignore this kind of thing entirely?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So, absolutely. I mean, I can't even tell you like how many people, like how many of these scholars who, criticize and rightfully obviously so British colonial rule and they've theorized post-coloniality and all of that, how they are completely like unable to see what India has been doing in Kashmir, but also if they potentially see it, then to actually, like, speak up about it. I again wanna say that there is a bit of a difference with younger folks and, like, my own colleagues and peers, who have been a bit more supportive, but for sure amongst kind of like an earlier generation, especially amongst the subaltern scholars, there's just this inability to really understand what the Kashmir issue is about. And I want to say that it kind of stems from two things. One is this idea that colonialism can only happen from the global north to the global south. And so like all India is doing is just nation building, like and it's obviously struggling to do so, but it's not colonization. And that it's just struggling with like center state relations and so on and so forth. But the second thing is I think it's so important to actually get to the root of who many of these post-colonial scholars are. And the way in which they're kind of able to present their brownness as like a source of marginality in the Indian Academy, or sorry, in the US Academy, right? Where it's just like, oh, they're just people of color here. But no, they are people who have immense, immense privileges. I mean, the number of people who are tied with India's military industry or like the government, like one of the leading historians at UCLA, his brother is Jay Shankar, right? India's foreign minister. And so like the political and ties, like family ties that a lot of these scholars have with those places of privilege in India should also not be discounted. And many of them are upper caste themselves. And so, caste, again, like this is so important to understand. And I would actually recommend my colleague Nishant's book, Indians on Indian Land, which really looks at how caste operates and functions, not just in the subcontinent or in India, but also in the diaspora. And I think Nishant's critique of a lot of these post-colonial scholars is super, super, super important. They have like a whole chapter on it. I would definitely recommend that you all read it because part of what Nishant argues is that one of the things that like a lot of these scholars, including people like Spivak, et cetera, did is also erase, the history of indigeneity in the Americas as well, and almost present it as like, "Oh, like, that's like a done deal, like, they're gone, like, they're not like, so they don't many of the post-colonial scholars didn't really even think through, or, like, analyze the contributions of indigenous scholars, and didn't value it either. And so you can see those gaps in the work that they've done. And then you can also see then how it would apply to a place like Kashmir, as well.
Yeah, I'll definitely check it out, and it's interesting because I'm familiar with a lot of the Marxist criticisms of post-colonial theory, and especially between Vivek Chibber and Spivak a couple years ago, and that whole dispute. But it's interesting how in analyzing the process of colonization itself, you can come to similar conclusions, which is, like Chibber basically says, well, a lot of these people just have a bourgeois character, kind of a neat Maoist explanation for, well, of course they're acting in their class interest, but I'd be very interested to hear a different form of analysis of where that's a problem. Um, and I suppose going forward, it does feel very and you talk a lot about this at the beginning as well about, just how much journalists and academics studying Kashmir are under attack, and especially since 2019, at least personally, felt very overwhelming, in terms of the difficulty of seeing a any sort of positive, future moving forward and a continuation of a lot of this violence. What are some ways that people can, kind of not become nihilistic, not really, lose hope, not become fatalist, and kind of maintain an enthusiasm for something more desirable?
Yeah, it's obviously it's really hard to even think about all of that given the scenes that we're witnessing from Gaza, continue to witness from Gaza. Sometimes it's just like, okay, maybe things should just end, as you mentioned, this nihilism. But I guess uh, something for me that has been interesting is that of course, we all will go through our periods of hopelessness and feeling like our work or things that we're doing is not going to have an impact, etc. But I think that the past month, in a weird way, and like this recent India Pakistan um, like whatever clash or almost war that you want to call it, has weirdly given me a different perspective in that I know and I can see that a lot more people who were mobilized by Palestine and what's been happening in Gaza are also getting more curious about Kashmir, and want to have conversations and want to learn and do more. Um, and so I think that gives me a bit of hope, but also this idea that, like, you know, India, like, part of what you don't always want to overstate is that settler colonial powers or colonial powers are like absolute, as in they'll always have so much power, they'll always have so much authority. I think part of what happens is that that erases the possibility of resistance and also like the fact that that doesn't always have to be the case. And so this narrative that India has tried to present of itself, that it's a superpower and that it's, and the way in which so many in the Indian leadership, but also in the media and political establishment, etc., envision India has really been punctured, I would say, in the past month. And I think they thought that they would get a lot more support from Western powers, and that they would kind of have like a very kind of commanding victory over Pakistan. That didn't happen. Of course, that means that unfortunately they will take out their anger on Kashmiris who bear the brunt of that. But it is to me, it's important to know that these powers are not invincible, and that eventually they have to fall, right? And the internal contradictions amongst themselves and within their societies will get to a point where the kind of violence that they have enacted, um, there will like there's this quote in Kashmiri. It's actually the name of a documentary that blood will leave its trail, and so you can't erase that, like, they will have to come to terms with what they've done in Kashmir, what they've done in, Punjab, what they've done in the Northeast. Just like Israel will have to come to terms with it and be, held accountable for it, and same with the US and its long history of imperial violence. And so I feel like we're at a moment or some kind of precipice where hopefully, potentially, the world is moving towards that, although it just feels really, really brutal and ugly right now. But I suppose maybe these are the like last gasps of dying empires, until something new can be created.
Absolutely, and very beautifully said. Hafsa, thank you so much for coming onto our podcast. I think I can speak for everybody here when I say that this has been an absolutely enlightening conversation. Where can people best check out your book and find your future work in case you're and if you have any future work that you need to plug, feel free to plug it right now.
Yeah, thank you. So I do have a website. It's just my name, hafsakanjwal.com. So you can find information about the book and how to get it, and some interviews, a couple of teach-ins as well, and some other works that I've written or co-written with some of my colleagues. So that's there, and then I also have an account on Instagram for the book called Colonizing Kashmir, or at Colonizing Kashmir. I'm not the best with social media, and a bit wary of it, but I know it's important. So yeah, so I think those are the places that people can reach out to me as well.
Okay, thank you so much, and you have a good one.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, bye.
Bye bye.
Da, da. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin, I barely made it.